Okay. Well, good day and welcome, Tom Barnett. Thank you very much for coming and being a part of this interview today.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. So this is the fifth in a series of women's worth, man's worth, the overfed body, the underfed soul. And this is about, and I'm going to steal Tom's description, the planned destruction of men. Because really what we're looking at is the history, the historical precedents that have taken place and continue today to take down our men, to take down the warriors, our first line of defense, leaving the women and the children very vulnerable. And we've explored numerous topics, and we went rather generally last interview, but this interview is going to be very specific. And I've asked Tom to talk about the history and the circumstances around circumcision of men. Now, before we start, Tom, would you do an introduction of yourself for everyone? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a holistic health practitioner, and my background is really in having had to have found a lot of the more alternative and deeper methods of learning, because the mainstream, which I had originally studied formally, did not come to my aid when I had my own conditions that I had to heal from. So that led to developing different ways and methods of learning and finding different resources that aren't normally available, I find, to the average consumer, because they simply don't have the need to dig that deep to find them. So that's been my journey over the last 15, 20 years.
Very good. I think that anyone who does find that journey usually has some reason to walk that particular road, and the doors that open and the rocks that roll around, and what we find is pretty rich. So yes, we all have those, and they're wonderful, even though they're not necessarily a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So Tom, if you could start and maybe give a little bit of the history of how did, and I'll probably add a few things here and there, but for what I have learned over the course of the last while, the history of how circumcision came about.
Well, you know what? You can probably educate me better on how it all came about and the history and everything. My experience with it is that it has its roots in religious underpinnings. It's there as like not anything, but most things in this system that we live under. It's a control mechanism. So it's designed in a way that is going against nature. So once people became aware of or developed the ability to tap into the darker side of things, they realize that the more you take a man away, or a woman away from their essential nature, the more they are then bound to man and the man-made systems, constructs, and ideals. And that also then leads into belief systems and being able to control the heart and mind of man. So especially with the work that I do in the rights and law, you can't serve two masters. That comes from the Bible. You're supposed to serve the Creator. And then when man started serving, other deities and men's systems, then it's kind of taking him out of his divinity and his essential self. And so the people that put these systems into place, they essentially know the ways by which they can take a man out of his essential self. Women as well, obviously, it doesn't just go for men. And one of the ways to do that is, it's well known that men spend a lot of time thinking with their penis, not necessarily with their brain. If you can control that aspect of his body, then you take a lot of control over him, his heart, and his mind. And so that's my understanding of how and why it started. As far as the dates, I mean, I know it's a Jewish practice, but I don't know the dates or anything. Maybe you can educate us on that, but that's my understanding of what it's for and why.
Very, very good. Well, my understanding is that, of course, the beginning of the Abrahamic religions were about 2,000-3,000 years ago, and that the Jewish religion has the ritual of the bris, of cutting the foreskin off the penis. And a rabbi would be brought in and would do this procedure. And it was always done without anesthesia, as it is today. And the nature of the type of surgery that was done wasn't done in a hospital, but it was, it could be done in someone's home. It was always at that point, there was blood and there was screaming. And there was, really a very torturous thing to think of on a very small infant, few days old, week old. And that's my knowledge of the actual history.
And didn't they used to do it with their teeth as well? It wasn't like even with an instrument. I mean, I'm sure they used instruments, but I've heard they actually would bite it off. Yes,
and then they would go down there, they would suck the blood, the rabbi. So it was a very, I mean, in my worldview, it's very, it's very dark to
demonic.
Consider. It's demonic. Thank you for the word. To create that level of pain at a time of such vulnerability and innocence, and I think there's like 270,000 nerve endings on the end of the penis, and so to not have any kind of anesthesia, to me, is a horrific idea, horrific thought.
Yeah, and on the metaphysical level as well, considering what's the life forces in blood. And when we talk about these, the darker forces, the negative high frequency beings, whatever people want to call them, it's all the same thing. They feed off of what the emotions that we have. Like, they don't have the same level of love, creativity, compassion that we have. And their food, their metaphysical food, is our darker, heavier emotions, our fear, anxiety, guilt, shame, all that sort of stuff. So when they can create very stressful and anxious moments, that actually feeds them, makes them more powerful. So you can imagine what's happening, taking that from the purity of an infant, and in that role, feeding on that, literally from the blood, but actually feeding on that emotion. That, to me, is what's really going on in that practice. It's the dark arts, and they really know what they're doing. That's no accident they decide to take the foreskin from a child and inflict that level of well, there's so many, there's not just pain, but that's an ultimate way to actually exert your force on somebody, your superiority on somebody, is to take that part of their body and inflict pain there and extract blood and extract energy from there. That's literally, going to the source, pretty much.
It
not
is
a nice thing to do.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, it's just not a nice thing to do, obviously, but that's by design. It's certainly no accident.
Well, and the process itself, where there is absolutely no protection, there's no advocate for the infant. So to be brought into a world where there's no advocacy at all, just to be strapped down, and
That's right.
the psychological scarring at that point for that infant must be horrific, because of course it was just within the first few days. So everything is relative to how much time we've lived, and that becomes the whole world for that infant. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. And when we're at that age, we're not unaware or unintelligent. We feel what's going on a deep level. And when our parents willingly give us up for that to happen, we lose a lot of trust. So there's a lot of deep-seated trust issues that most human beings have. And part of it, in coming from that, particularly with men, there's a real deep-seated mistrust that's built into the trauma body of, the body of the mind. Sorry, the mind of the body. The body has its own mind separate from this mind. And then that's built into this body. And it's like, I've even heard from people, because some people have very vivid memory of being even born. I know of some people who can describe what it was like to be born. Like, we're not supposed to remember things before we're about 1 or 2 years of age, but Some people have described to their parents like what was around, and the parents' mouths are open. Like, how would you possibly know that? It's because they remember being born. And so I've heard people describe to me what it was like to receive their first vaccinations, that they said, I can't, like, you're my parent. You're supposed to protect me. Like, nature tells me that. I don't have to learn it or know it. I just know it in my body. You protect me. Then to have you willingly give me up and expose me to that, to being injected, to being forced into pain, it's like they remember it, and they remember the inherent feeling was distrust. I can't believe you would betray me. And so the same thing goes with that, with the circumcision, especially before the time of anesthesia and, you know, when it was bitten off and whatever else. That's like, there's a lot that, and then obviously that being ingrained into a culture becomes an epigenetic memory. So even boys that didn't have that happen after a certain amount of time, having had it happen to that many of their ancestors is actually built into some cellular memory.
Oh, wow.
So the distrust is there too. It's just a way to breed distrust, fear, darkness into men who haven't even been circumcised, because if their forefathers had been for several generations by that method, then that's actually bred into them. Like when you breed dogs and you want them to smell good or to fetch stuff, you breed it into them.
Right. And what we do know about any species that is bred and inbred like that, we know that it weakens them. We know that they become susceptible to like certain breeds of dogs, hip dysplasia, or certain autoimmune diseases. And so if we look at the human species having this epigenetic memory, then we bring forward something that is as sacred as love, and that is trust. And so where do we, so we know that this is a Jewish tradition, but it has been taken on by more than just the Jewish religion. Right. So could you, I know that in the Catholic religion, circumcision is generally frowned upon. So if you were born Catholic, you were not circumcised. And I'm not sure how far spread it is in the Christian aspect, but could you maybe talk to that? And
Yeah, it's definitely in a lot of those other religions. The reason I was laughing is because the same weird, fake, false germ theory that goes on with the world with regards to medicine and vaccines, that was the reason that a lot of the West took on circumcision, because it's cleaner. It keeps it's too dirty under there. You know, you could get infections or whatever. It's like as if the body just was going to grow an appendage to the end of the penis that somehow is going to make it fall off. You know, it's this inherent distrust of nature, again, separating man from not from nature, but his nature. So therefore, hey, look, medicine to the rescue. We'll just snip that off. Won't even feel it because we'll give you an anesthetic. And now medically, it's the clean thing to do. It's for hygiene. And people are sold on that because people are so easily removed when they're not so connected. Somebody who's very connected to nature and themselves would laugh at that. They would just go, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But people who don't have that connection, again, removing man from his nature and woman from hers, makes them easily led, easily controlled, easily susceptible to propaganda and the suggestion that, hey, there could be a better way. And it's in the hospital and it's in the hands of the doctors who you'll just have to pay. And that's basically what's happened in the Western world. So my father, for example, was brought up in a Catholic household with his mother. He was circumcised for that reason. And when my brother and I were born, they still had that idea of cleanliness, we should do that. But they actually let me and my brother uncircumcised, which is a real surprise because they think that medicine is like God. They're funnily enough, they're very, what's the word for anti-religious? Atheist. They're very atheist. But weirdly, science and medicine is their religion. You know, like everything that they have a go at people about being religious about, they are that religious about vaccines and medicine and hospitals save everybody and doctors are gods and all that kind of thing. They'll say, oh, no, doctors aren't gods. But the way that they talk about, you know, how lucky we are to have vaccines and all that, So it's a surprise actually that they turned around on that and left my brother and I uncircumcised. However, when I was, I think 5 or 6, around that age, I was having issues with the foreskin being painful. I couldn't, like, for anybody that doesn't know, men need to pull the skin of their foreskin back to clean the penis. And when they're, young boys, they're not yet, sexually active. So they're not having regular erections and all that sort of stuff. So it was actually painful. It was like the skin was too small or something. So the doctors suggested circumcision, and obviously they just said, yeah, fine, because my father and his brother and their fathers and all that were all circumcised, so it was just normal. I would imagine it was not the only option. Knowing what I know about medicine and alternatives and whatever, I would imagine there are several other options, but surgery was the first option given, and that was the first option accepted. So I ended up being circumcised when I was 5 or 6. And at that age, very conscious of what's going on. There was a lot of pain associated with that whole experience, from going into the hospital and receiving a large injection into the leg to put me to sleep. That was very painful. I remember waking up in a lot of pain. I remember being in a lot of pain for about a couple of weeks while I had stitches and bleeding from the end of my penis after I was circumcised at age 5, walking around the shops with no pants on and stuff. Even at that age, feeling there was a bit self-conscious, like, should I really be walking around without pants on? And I've got like a wound here and that. There's elements there that I still very consciously remember, which actually maybe we can handle some other points first. But I guess part of podcasts or part of live streams that I do, it's one thing to highlight all the negativity and the horror that goes along with things. But I find so many people just peddle fear porn, and that's it. It's like, we did a great job telling people how bad the world is. But without the solutions, I don't feel that we're really doing anyone any favors. So we'll, at some point, whenever you feel, we'll get into overcoming those traumas and bringing the power back to the individuals. But that's my experience. And I just know that it can be very inbuilt into men and their thought processes, even if they originally think that they'll leave their boys uncircumcised.
Mm-hmm. Very good points. And, I never, on my own fruition, thought of the issue of circumcision as an empowering action against men. It was something that came up through some conversations. So yes, we definitely, we all have issues that we deal with. Circumcision for men, and we can either be victims of our circumstances, or we can rise above. So we definitely will need to talk about that. And obviously you're a wonderful example of someone who's been through that, and it did not hold you back as becoming the person that you are today. So Tom, could you maybe describe a little bit about maybe a little bit more about what circumcision is I'm assuming everybody knows what circumcision is, but maybe just walk through the steps of how that occurs, if you could do so.
In the modern world, it's a surgical procedure. So the end of the foreskin is cut, which then allows them to split and cut back a length of the foreskin to just over the glands of the penis. And then they will usually stitch it there. So they'll cut the skin back to that point and then, put a couple of stitches in. And it essentially just leaves the glands of the penis exposed all the time. So there's obviously because it's a surgical procedure, there's a recovery time associated with that, because there's essentially a wound, a stitch or stitches that need to go through their standard healing process. The idea being that, obviously it is meant to be for cleanliness, but it's not really the case. Like it's a self-cleaning organ. We don't need all that intervention. The problems that can be associated with it is that it can reduce, from a physical point of view, it can reduce sensitivity. It can reduce sexual pleasure. Some men can't orgasm or find it very hard to orgasm if they've had that procedure done. Because as you mentioned, there are so many nerve endings there that even just, you're going to lose some sensitivity as a matter of course, but anything slightly wrong can have a huge consequence. And so physiologically, that's where things can go wrong. But psychologically, there's also a lot that can go wrong, which can cause all kinds of, issues with impotence and issues with distrust around, like, have you ever patted a cat that's been desexed, and you go to like rub its belly and it'll just with its claws. As soon as you get near its belly, it'll lash out. It's because it had that, a traumatic experience about being desexed. And it's a very similar procedure to wanting to do that with a male penis. It's not obviously desexing, but it's very similar. And so there's a lot of issues that men can have with that. So, like, it's not always the case, though. A lot of people just slam it as it's always going to have that effect. I mean, there's I don't mind talking about it because I've got a lovely partner that won't mind me talking about it. It's like there's certainly the sensitivity and all that is like perfectly fine for me. It's not like there's no trauma around it. There's not like I have a distrust. The sensitivity is great. There's no, I don't feel like I missed out on anything, but I actually have personal friends who aren't like that, who absolutely feel like they were robbed because they don't have, like, the sexual pleasure is not all, they can't feel it in their whole body, for example. They can barely feel it in their penis. And so you're meant to feel it in your whole body, even as a man. It's not supposed to be just a localized pleasure. And so when that whole nerve pathway is working well, you will get it in your whole body, which thankfully I have. I think, as you learn more about these processes and the medical industry, if I had have had anything wrong, I would have so much rage in me, because that is one of man's primal. It's like, it doesn't make you a man. So a man that can't get an erection or has some injury to that area of the body, whatever, that doesn't mean he's not a man. So I'm not saying that, but there's an element of being a man where your primal nature and your arousal is a huge part of that. And a man with his fire is very creative. And a lot of that creative fire is sexual energy. It's the most creative energy in the universe because it's what creates life. It's where life comes from. So to have that messed with, I just know, to empathize with the guys that I know personally who have those issues, that would just enrage me. And it would be you would have to go through a lot of letting go in order to move through that. And thankfully, I have not had to go through that, because I can only imagine what that's like for a man to have essentially his manhood taken from him because of a procedure.
Well, isn't that an interesting word, manhood? I mean, the foreskin being the hood of the penis.
Yep.
And to have that removed surgically, psychically, the whole physical removal. And what we're talking about really is the planned destruction of manhood today, beginning at birth with the removal of the foreskin with so many of the men. Very interesting. So do you think that a man's, I mean, this is a personal question for me, but preoccupation with their second brain, the penis, comes to some degree from that early trauma? Or do you think that's just being a man?
It can be both. It's definitely part of being a man. I won't lie. But I'll get into this because this is an interesting topic. But it's actually quite well known, because I've counseled quite a number of people through my earlier times doing holistic health. There's a lot of people who are hypersexual, like women who are nymphomaniacs. Oftentimes they were abused when they were young.
Yes.
So a lot of times, if there's sexual abuse, you will be hypersexual when you're older. You'll crave sex. There's some element there that's not dealt with, and it actually leads to hypersexuality. So yes, to answer your question, there's an element there of being tampered with, and then also that can take you away from your ability to remain focused and in your heart, because if you're always in that lower energy center, you're always in that primal, aggressive, protection, fight, flight, all that kind of stuff. It can bring you there and not into your heart enough, and that can take a man into, it can just keep him from his nature often. It's certainly the opposite of that is when somebody's all tantra and all just, I'm in my heart all the time, I don't use my penis. And that's kind of like it's almost like going to the opposite extreme. Sometimes it's as an avoidance. It's like I'm trying to avoid that part of me rather than actually moving into it transmuting it and finding that place on the other side.
Good point.
A lot of times people do that. They just go right away from that essential nature, and they've tricked themselves, but they haven't really. It's a different, it's like my this part of me that has that is wearing this mask, and now I'm just aware that I have it, so I'm changing it to this mask now and presenting myself as spiritual, but really it's the same place that is expressing that it never changed.
Yeah.
As opposed to transmuting, which is the proper, it's where you move through it. But that's actually the part of a man that can lead him to himself is that transmutation. It's not, it's still like a man who remains a man will bend a woman over and ravish her any moment of the day. But he's not always in that aggressive low state. He can be in his heart, but still have that, that ability to just take a woman, whether he's homosexual or heterosexual, whatever. I just mean that energy. And so when we can harness that energy, not ignore it, not block it, not repress it, but harness that energy, we can move right into it and become something like far greater, far more. And that's when you can bring it into your heart center and express that. And that's when you'll find a man who is very balanced. You can see he's still got that fire. He's certainly not a guy that you would mess with because, he's just all spiritual now and I can do whatever I want, slap him around and he'll never do anything. That's not the case. It's just that he's not led purely by that base instinct. He has that, which means that he can use it at any time, but it's tempered. And he's very much aware of everything else, which really just means that he's balanced masculine, feminine. That's pretty much, to me, well, I'm not saying that's the absolute truth, but to me, that's what it is. He's balanced masculine and feminine within himself.
Mm-hmm. Very, very, very well spoken. And, of course, some things came up in my mind as you were talking. And when I think about, the early sexual abuse of our men, or the women, but and then the infusion of pornography into the cultures. So one destabilizes the infant, the individual, starting with circumcision and then any form of sexual abuse. And of course, our sexuality is something that we explore on our own if we're so fortunate, and we come into our own evolving as a sexual being. But that seems to be less frequently than I ever imagined, given what I have been hearing about with all the ritualistic sexual abuse that's happened throughout history. And then when you add in the pornography, which begins to objectify the woman and take the relationship of this loving act just in putting it into the penis rather than into the mind and into the heart, and making it that whole unified experience, as you were talking about. We again disempowers a man. It can quite literally mean that an erection can't happen. So it's not even necessarily circumcision alone, but if you combine the two or the three elements, we begin to see some pretty confusing relationships to sexuality. Have you anything else to maybe add on to that?
Yeah, the hypersexualization of society in general. So, and the religious indoctrination that still comes through societal constructs where you're actually taught to objectify women, but then taught that it's wrong to objectify women at the same time. So it's very confusing for a male to know how to act around women, especially as men are mostly confused within themselves. They're either too far towards, oh no, I'd never look at your breast, I'd never do this, I'd never, like too respectful, or they're the other way where they're like very overtly just trying to get something physical or express their sexual desire for them, but in a way that's not very subtle or sophisticated or whatever. So it's almost like there's two extremes, and it's confusing for most men, or not most, but a lot of men in the middle. And there is a rampant overuse of pornography, absolutely, and it's available to boys from a relatively young age. So I remember when we were teenagers, not necessarily doing the right thing. We went a lot of boys, when they're going through they go through rough kind of times trying to find themselves, and stealing becomes a thing that you do for fun, shoplifting. I didn't do it a lot, but I was hanging around with guys that did it a lot. And it took me a while before I separated from that kind of group. And they would always go and steal Playboy and Penthouse magazines, which some guys will probably remember before the age of the internet. There were magazines. And so the boys would go after school and they'd steal chocolate bars and they'd steal pornography magazines. And then, you know, you're fitting in, so you go hang out with that group and do what they do and that sort of stuff. And so we'd be looking through all the magazines, and it's all about the body parts of the women. You know, it's just literally just objectifying women from that point. And the more you do it, the more male you are. You know, like if you're not taking part in that, you're like, oh, what are you? You know, whatever words that you use, pussy, girl, whatever. You know, that's what boys, and especially when there's older boys. So some of the schools we went to, like, there would be the older 15, 16-year-olds hanging out with us when we're 12, 13, 14. And at that age, if you remember, somebody who's one grade or 1 year above you, they're like, whoa, they're like an adult.
Yeah.
You know, at that age, somebody a little bit older than you is like way older than you. And so you're quite impressionable by, you know, what they think is cool, or them not calling you a pussy or something like that. And I grew up in a time where that was very normal. Like, you called names if you're not being tough and masculine and all that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, you learn to objectify women from that point. But a lot of people like myself, I always had this inherent love for girls for some reason. And I never followed through that path. And honestly, not just saying this because I'm on a podcast, I never got into pornography. Was exposed to it, but I was just like, I don't really get what's so appealing. But unfortunately, a lot of men don't have that natural. There's something natural there in it for me. Like, if a woman has fake anything in her body, it's instantly not attractive to me. Not because they're not a beautiful woman in her way, but because there's something unnatural, and I can't. It doesn't compute. My body doesn't compute. Whereas for a lot of guys, that doesn't seem to be there. That nature instinct isn't really there. And so they're very easily led out of their self, their nature, and then they're very confused. When you're not in yourself, it's a confusing place because you're almost transhuman. Despite never being chipped or given an mRNA gene modification injection, despite never being that, you're still taken out of your nature, which means you're going away from nature, which means you're going towards being transhuman, you know? So that's where the men get the confusion. That's where they find that inability to connect to their own feminine and therefore women. And it's a really negative cycle. The pornography cycle is very, like you said earlier, it's part of many, angles and agendas in order to take the masculinity from men.
Yes. And of course it robs from women, but then when women sexualize themselves so early, or they sexualize their children so young. I mean, we see these young girls who they're sexually aware at the age of 6 and 7, and even younger. And I'm astonished. And so we give these confusing messages to men. And then there's already the confusion and the psychological damage from the beginning, and then the infusion of the pornography. It all seems to have a pretty dark agenda. And then we wonder why the divorce rate is 50%. At least it is in the United States. And so when we look Christianity and Jewish and Islamic religions, there was a very different story going on of men and women coming together in relationship. And while not without some obvious issues and problems, we didn't have this kind of demonic nature that was a part of that. And so maybe a little bit on that.
Well, yeah, it is that confusion mechanism, because it is actually natural for people to be sexual from a young age. Boys play with their penises from a young age. I know several girls that learned to use like the faucet in a bath on themselves when they're 6 or 7, not being exposed to anything, just naturally playing with themselves, and it feels good. It's like, And in tribal culture, actually, they would expose younger children to actually watching people making love, the adults, because when they're set up in those cultures where they pretty much move to, yeah, that boy, your daughter will be with my son, that sort of thing. Part of a man's job is a man needs to be able to provide and he needs to be able to protect. Those are like the core provision and protection. But there's also the ability to to satisfy. And so if a man's not able to satisfy a woman, he won't be put into the gene pool, so to speak, of, suitable men for the women in the tribe. So they would actually have people watch the others make, oh, so, okay, that's how you do it, that kind of thing, to see it so you can actually get a feeling for it. So it's actually not abnormal to expose youth to sex, but it's the way that it's done. Like anything, it's the way that it's done. What is being imparted? Where is the overall feeling of love or respect or masculinity, femininity? What's the dance all about, as opposed to it being all about objectification, pleasure of one part of the body or whatever, and goal oriented. That's one of the things that I hear from women, is that they don't like when men have goal oriented sex. And that comes from pornography. So it's like different from lovemaking, it's like a different, totally different energy to it all. So the way that is distorted is that agenda. It's taking such a natural thing and distorting it so that you're taken away from that nature. And that's where we see the religious indoctrination. And then these practices of, they circumcise women too. Young girls in certain African countries are circumcised from their clitoris, which is, horrific. And so, and then we have the hypersexualization through marketing in the Western culture, and which is pure objectification. And then also simultaneously telling people it's wrong to do so. So people are walking around confused. And you see the way young women will present themselves in public. Like, they really don't wear a lot of clothing sometimes, even when they're 14 years of age. And their parents can't tell them not to, because then they need to rebel against that. And it's almost like the more promiscuous they can appear amongst their peer group, the more they're fitting in, because that's what Beyonce and their pop stars they look at on Instagram, that's what they portray. And they're their role models at that age. So they're certainly not going to look at that. You can't fight. You can't, unless you're such an inspiring parent, which is what we should aspire to be, then they're going to take that kind of influence and then be confused about why boys aren't respecting them, or boys have this weird agenda about what they're conditioned to do. And it's it can separate us all a lot from our essential selves. The last element of that is also what the medical establishment will do to say, well, we can take away your fertility. If you wish, we can give you a vasectomy, or we can, snip your tubes or whatever if you're a woman. It's that level. The degree to which somebody would think that that's a good idea is the degree to which they are absolutely removed from their essential nature. So it's coming at us from every angle, but we have a lot of ways that we can overcome that, which is positive.
Well, yes, and to even add to that, to have breast enlargement or changes to our lips or our faces or any other part of our body as a woman, and the whole surgical changing, as if to say who you were born to be and what you look like is completely unacceptable in order to meet the stereotype of what we've been taught is sexually appealing. And the fact that we will undergo knives to create that physically, when really our empowerment and our sexuality and our femininity is within. It's connecting there. It has nothing to do with our external self. And so the stories have really gotten pretty messed up, have they not?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's true, if women spoke to men more than they spoke to magazines and other women, they would find that men find so many different aspects of a natural woman highly attractive. Mm-hmm. And it's more than anything, it's actually her femininity and her nature. Like a young guy won't admit that. He'll say, no, it's a breast, it's a bum, it's something like that. But a man will tell you it's her femininity, it's her nature, it's her softness. That's the thing that's the most attractive. Women with smaller breasts don't necessarily realize that a lot of men love that. They actually prefer that. And not to say, I mean, anything, what I mean, I'm just taking that as one example, or size and shape, whatever. They don't realize that that doesn't need to change, that they're made that way for a reason, and they are perfect in that way. And men too, men have a lot of dysmorphia issues as well. Don't get me wrong. There's you want to see how many men feel completely out of their body, or emasculated, or like not up to scratch because of body image issues. It's insane. And so, and they don't realize as well that women don't need them to have an 8-pack and, look like an Adonis. They don't, that's what they're conditioned to think. The way women are conditioned to think, you have to have this size breast and this tiny waist and this hair down to your waist. It's like, that's not the case. And for men, they don't have to look like a Greek god. It's, yeah, there's a lot there, but this is the beauty of it, because that's the start. And the more you actually get into your nature and can connect to your internal masculine, feminine, that all fades away. And you find that pure connection with another or with many others, because you find it in yourself. And that's the beautiful thing. That's the solution to all of this, is getting, it's almost like a gift. It's almost like, hey guys, here's all these, red herrings everywhere. And when you can realize that they're your way, they're your marking post to get back to you. And when you can do that, and you can learn to trust, and you can learn to be vulnerable, and you can learn to find the perfection in what you are, that doesn't mean that you don't take any pride in yourself. Like, oh, well, I'm made how I am, so I'll just eat Big Macs every day and don't exercise and whatever. That's not what it means. But it just means that when you do find that love for yourself, you naturally take care of yourself. Then you naturally smell good, because the way your body is in tune with itself and nature means that you put out a certain scent, which is natural. It's not perfumes, and that's what the pheromones are. And when your body is functioning well, you attract people. And if the way you look, you'll be radiant. It's that inner radiance, and that's what people like. And that's a huge topic in itself. But the whole point being is that you get to that when you start allowing those false ideals to crumble, and then you just find that essential nature. And funnily enough, the more connected you are to nature, the easier that is.
Well, isn't that true? I mean, we are of nature. We heal in nature. We find, we resonate with the resonance of nature, and so anything that separates us from nature, any kind of psychological scarring or a trauma that takes us away from our integral self, moves us away from that natural place that we were born with. And so, maybe in closing, you could maybe talk just a little bit about, solutions to anyone who might be, holding on to maybe some pain from experiences, and and maybe some direction on self-empowerment or whatever.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it always comes down to, first of all, an acceptance, because when we have that things shouldn't be the way they are, I was robbed, I was hard done by, we're just creating another story which does not serve us. So the first thing that we have to do is at least accept it. We don't have to love it, but we can at least accept it. So, all right, things happened. That's then, this is now. That's not happening now, it's done. So if we accept what's happened, maybe we've lost sensitivity, or maybe we still have trauma, trust issues and whatever. At least if we accept where we are, we can move from there. If we never have the acceptance, we always have this polarity there, which we'll never overcome. So we have to accept it so we can separate from it. From there, we can actually find if there are any gifts in it. That's very hard for people to do when they feel extremely hard done by. But if we can find some gift, that we've learned something, everything teaches us one way or another. The pain is always a teacher, no matter what. So then we can find the gift or the lesson. What is in this that I've learned from? What way have I grown? Not in my body, but my other bodies. How have I grown as a result? And then have gratitude for that aspect. Then decide what it's going to be from here. So once we've moved through acceptance, finding the gift and having some gratitude, then we can move into, what am I creating from here? And that's when we can rewrite our stories. We can rewrite what it means to have whatever is going on, or whatever we feel was in the past. We can rewrite that. And the way we do that is decide we get to create who we are. And that's using that primal energy. That's that pure creative force that we're made from, and only knows how to create. What are we going to do with that? Which turns into the dream. What is it that I am doing in the world that's uniquely me? I mean, other people are making videos and doing podcasts and they're health practitioners, but what is it that I'm doing that makes it, what's my mark in the world? It's something that I do uniquely. All the same things other people do, but I do it in my unique way. So what is that? So it's finding that. And through finding that, we very much empower ourselves. That becomes something that they, the ones being the darker forces that try to extract that energy, they can't have that anymore. Because now I'm creating it, not them. They're not determining how I feel. They're not, they created the trauma story. Well, we created it, but they gave us the opportunity to create it. So then when we move through it and now we're creating, we're actually operating in a completely different sphere to them. They're no longer eating our energies. So then there can also be ways that we may need to heal or deal with direct trauma. So when there's trauma associated with a sexual organ, for example, we may need to go into that specifically to heal it. There are several ways to do that. One is simply giving love and compassion to that area through either yourself, or if you do have a loving partner, somebody you trust, allowing them to give that as well. And then, like actually speaking to it and speaking to I've got a video on YouTube, which is called the, I always forget what I called it, shadow unconscious exercise. And it's a way to interact with your younger self when something was going on. So as a very brief rundown, you essentially use your imagination to create your younger self, or to be there around them when something's going down, let's say a circumcision. Even if you have no conscious recollection, your unconscious knows it. Mm-hmm. And the unconscious doesn't know time. So what we give to ourselves in our mind in like 1982 or whatever, or 1963, it doesn't know that it's not now, that it's 2021 now. It doesn't know that, doesn't know time. So essentially what happens is, if we're in that situation, we were 3 days old and somebody bit the end of our penis off, and we can actually put ourselves in that time. Now, what we didn't get, the unmet needs of the child, as according to Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, is safety and security. We missed out on that. Trust, that was all gone. We missed out on love and affection. That's all gone. All the basic needs of a child. And so we can actually give that. We can put ourselves in that scenario and we can say, look, regardless of what's going on, I understand what's happening. You're having the end of your penis bitten off, but you're loved, you're cared for, you're safe, you're secure. You can surround I don't want to put words in people's mouth, but whatever you feel that was missing, you can give to yourself then. Giving it to yourself then means you're receiving it now in this present moment as well, because we're really dealing with more of the unconscious. Now, that's quite a simplified process, but there's many other modalities that can go into that more deeply. But if you do that effectively, that's really all you need to do. That's what you're doing, is essentially just rewriting that trauma story. And then, having ways to expel and to express, because when we repress something, it's the opposite of that is expression. And because there's a high level of judgment, like self-judgment or judgment from others or expectation, for a man, for example, if he's had his manhood taken from him, there's expectation. He should be able to perform this, or he should feel this. Those are expectations. Then there's judgment. Well, I'm not up to par because I can't feel this, or I can't get that happening, or whatever. So there's judgment as well. Those are very, very heavy for the emotional and the psychological and the spiritual bodies. So we can go beyond that by expressing without judgment or expectation. So I have that art therapy creative exercise on YouTube as well, which is a way to express without judgment at all. It's expressing purely for expression's sake without it needing to be anything. So that might be the first time in our life that we are able to express without judgment, without expectation, and therefore we're turning repression into expression, getting what's stored in here and getting it out. And then the other way to do that is with bioenergetic exercises, which there are many different ways to do that. Some people like breath work. Some people like doing shaking style, where you just allow your body to shake in putting yourself in different positions, allow your body to just shake itself out. They're two of the ones that work effectively. And then there's just freedom of expression through the body. You can look up, there's different Taoist practices, different tantric practices that you can start to learn about, which can help you to free not this mind but the body mind. Trauma is stored in the whole body, is to start to expel that. And there's many ways you can do that as well, and that really goes a long way to helping. At the end of the day, after all the years you might do of therapy and bioenergetics, it's a decision. It's a decision that you are a man, you are complete, you are taking responsibility and power for yourself and creating your own reality. And therefore nobody else is doing that for you. And therefore the power is right there with you. And at the end of all that therapy and that, you're really just making that decision, but the therapy helps you to get there. So I think that's all I can fit into a short summary.
Very well done. And, I mean, just to add into that, in New German medicine, the awareness that trauma is the first part of when the disease sets into the physical body. And if we think about, the early trauma, whether it's circumcision or sexual abuse or any other traumas that happen, they do express themselves, as you talk about. And so working to connect with ourself and become compassionate and forgiving and gentle and discovering our empowerment, that releases all those physical diseases within the body. And I can't help but think of all the prostate cancer in men. And, of course, there are other reasons for prostate cancer, but, it's right there with the penis. There's definitely got to be a connection, and we can heal. Our men can heal. I mean, I say we. I don't have a penis, but it's possible to heal all of that through going back in and empowering oneself. And it's true of any trauma that brings that dis-ease into our body. So I think how you described that process was beautifully done, and thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. You're welcome. It's funny, it's some people don't like me bringing it up because they go, "Oh, stop doing the Catholic thing," but it's literally just a statistic that the highest incidences of cancer of the sex organs are in Catholic. When you look at all are they men? Are they women? Are they West or the East? Do they have a religion? It's like when you correlate all of the demographics, it's Catholics have the highest incidence of cancer of the sex organs. Catholics are known to have in various, not all of them, but in various elements of their offshoots of churches, it's very repressive of sexual thought and feeling. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to go, well, repression of sexuality, then cancer of the sex organs, they correlate very highly.
Yes, very interesting. I did not know that. Well, I think that it's very encouraging to really, for all of us to understand that any trauma can be healed. And it's just about really, would you not say, recognition of the trauma and then going inside and through empowerment, becoming that empowered person. And go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. There's actually something quite interesting there, which I can finish on because it might help a lot of people, is that sometimes we don't remember the trauma. A lot of times trauma is so traumatic, it's totally blocked from the mind. That's our protection mechanism. But what lies in place is the story. So without having to go into the trauma of, oh, I was touched here, or I was like butchered there, or whatever it was, we don't need to remember that at all. I think it's actually counterproductive to try to go into, was I raped? Was I beaten? Was I snipped? Was I cut? What happened? Well, I think it's counterproductive to try to actually get into that, but the story remains. And we know the story because things come up. What are we triggered by? Oh, somebody's giving me their love and they get away from me or don't go near that part of my body. It's like, whoa, hang on, there's a story there. So the story is what we need to dissolve. And we do that simply by allowing that part of ourselves to die. It's not even necessarily having to go back into it and come through it to transmute it. Sure, we can do that. But literally, it's just allowing that part of us to die off. And a lot of us are going to have to die many deaths in our lifetime to find ourselves, because it's those shells, the protective shells are our stories. They're there, they serve us for a time until we know what they are and how they're holding us back. Then we can go, okay, well, that doesn't serve me anymore. And we choose to shed that skin and that allow that part of us to die off. And that means getting deeper into trust, which is deeper into love, for the divine, for ourselves, for a loved one in our life or whatever. And, and then that's the path. And it's not easy either. Like anytime you die, you feel like you're going to die. It can feel like that. So it's certainly not, oh yeah, I'll just shed that skin now. No worries. Then I'll go watch some TV.
Well, and that's a pretty good pun too, to shed the skin. We're talking about foreskin, circumcision. Yeah. That's very profound. And yes, we have that story. We have that road. We can follow it. All we have to do is desire to make that change in our life and to let go of the habitual pattern that is there in our life that keeps us down, holds us down, keeps people in shackles. And the intentional perpetration that was to disempower us, because like today in 2020, was it May 26th, it's our empowerment that is going to rise us out of the shackles that are intended to hold us down. But when we are empowered, we can't be held down.
That's right. Absolutely. And we can do that to ourselves. And when people find that so difficult, that's why we're a tribal species. So Indigenous would do it through ceremony and various practices. We can do that through ceremony and practices. Most people in our culture, that means getting a therapist or someone to work with. And if you're really in love and trust, in a true loving relationship with your partner, then it can come from your partner as well, or anybody, your family member, anybody that you can actually allow yourself to die off, to go further into trust or love with another, or it's done through ceremony, or it's done through working with a therapist or whatever. Find something that works for you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tom. It's been a great pleasure to have some time today and listen to what you have to say. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathleen. It was great.